Ethan Jennings's pen went still over the notebook. He'd circled the number so hard, the paper had started to tear. 41,517. Circled it, then circled it again, like doing it twice might make it mean something different. It didn't. His hand was shaking, ballpoint tip resting against 41,517, like an accusation. Behind him, the console did its work without him, the readout ticking down digit by digit, the exact same number the pen refused to leave. 41,516, 41,515, 41,514. He said it out loud because saying it made it real, made it something other than a coincidence he could excuse away in the morning report. It's not the same signal. His voice didn't sound like his in the dead quiet of the relay room. It's the same countdown. Last time it ended at 0. He'd taken this shift for the money and the silence, 11 hours a night, babysitting a listening dish, planted on a ridge above a valley that didn't have a name on current maps, only on the old ones. Micrometeor tracking mostly. Space debris chatter. Nothing that needed a human awake for it, except insurance liability and a union rule from 1974. He hadn't taken it to relearn Petra Halloran's ghost story. Petra had trained him here 11 months ago, grey and unimpressed, the kind of woman who called every anomaly weather until it wasn't. She was the one who told him the valley below used to have a town in it, Ashford Hollow, 400 and something people, gone in one night in 1986. Official record says a gas leak, mandatory evacuation. Petra never bought the gas leak part. She said the evacuation order went out at 2:14 a.m. and by dawn there wasn't a single vehicle unaccounted for on any road out of that valley. There also wasn't a single vehicle anyone could prove had actually left. He'd laughed at the time. He wasn't laughing now because 41,516 had just become 41,515, and the archive folder he'd pulled without deciding to pull it had a file inside it time-stamped from that exact night in 1986. He opened it anyway. The waveform loaded slow, the relay's ancient software chugging against a file that old. When it finally rendered, he didn't need the software to overlay it against tonight's live feed. He could see it with his eyes. Same shape, same pulse spacing, same 17-millisecond stutter at the front of every third burst that any other tech would call a hardware artifact and move on from. He wasn't moving on from it. He pulled tonight's readout up beside it on the second monitor, and the two waveforms sat there, identical, 40 years apart, like two photographs of the same hand. The number kept falling. 41,502, 41,501. Ethan reached for the phone to call it in, and then didn't, because call it in as what? A repeating number. A pattern match against a file that predated his birth. Nobody was driving up this ridge at midnight for that. So instead, he did the thing Petra always said not to do with signals like this. He answered it. The relay wasn't built for transmission, not really. It was a listener, not a talker. But there was a diagnostic ping buried in the maintenance suite. A single flat tone meant to test the dish's own hardware, bounced back off nothing in particular. He triggered it on a whim he immediately regretted. The countdown didn't change speed, it didn't stutter. But 4 seconds after his ping went out, a new sound layered in underneath the burst pattern, faint, almost buried in the noise floor. He pulled his headphones on and leaned into the desk to be sure he wasn't imagining it. Voices, not words, not yet, just the shape of voices, dozens of them, close together, low, like a room full of people, all reciting something under their breath at slightly different speeds. He should have logged it and gone home. He pulled the audio into the analyzer instead and started slowing it down. At quarter speed, the voices spread apart enough to almost separate. At an eighth, they did. Numbers. Dozens of overlapping voices, all counting, not together, not in sync, like a crowd taking attendance out loud all at once, each person announcing themselves in turn, over and over, looping. 368, 12, 209. He recognized what it was before he wanted to, not a countdown to something arriving. A head count, somebody, some many bodies, reciting their own number in a tally, on a loop, like it had been running for 40 years without anyone there to hear it until tonight. The console ticked past 41,000 even. Ethan's hands had gone cold on the keyboard, but he didn't stop the playback, because underneath the layered counting, there was a second, older recording bleeding through, degraded, tape hiss thick, and it took him 3 passes to be sure of what he was hearing. It was Petra's voice. Petra, who'd been dead 6 years before Ethan ever took this job, reciting a number of her own. He didn't sleep after that. He couldn't have if he'd tried. Instead, he went digging, not through the official archive, but the shadow one. The folder every relay tech before him had apparently added something to, and nobody had apparently deleted, going back decades. Incident logs nobody filed with the county, personal notes. He found a technician's diary entry from 1986, 4 days before the gas leak, describing this exact tone, coming in on this exact dish. A line at the bottom stopped him cold. He read it 4 times before it stopped rearranging itself in his head. It doesn't end at 0 because the town disappears. The town disappears because it ends at 0. Whoever's counting is the last number added. Don't answer it. Don't let it hear you back. Ethan looked at the diagnostic ping log. Timestamp 4 minutes ago. His. He'd already answered it. The number on the console read 40,996, and Ethan realized with a cold drop through his stomach that it hadn't been falling in real time to match some external clock. It had dropped by exactly 1 the instant he sent his ping, and then kept counting down from there, same pace as before, like his answer had simply been folded into a total that was already running. He wasn't watching a countdown to an event. He was watching a countdown of listeners. He tried to leave. The relay room door was the same door it had always been, propped the same half-inch it was always propped for the draft. And Ethan told himself that as he crossed the room toward it, like saying it would make his legs move faster. The overlapping voices in his headphones kept counting, patient, endless, and somewhere in the layered noise, a new voice had joined since the last time he'd checked. He didn't put the headphones back on to confirm it. He didn't need to. He got the door open. The night outside was the wrong kind of quiet. No insects, no wind moving the dry grass on the ridge, no distant traffic hum from the 2-lane road at the bottom of the valley that should have carried up this far on a clear night the way it always had. Below him, where Ashford Hollow used to be marked on the old maps, there were lights. Not many, a dozen maybe, small, steady, evenly spaced, the way porch lights sit along a street that's still, technically, a neighborhood. There hadn't been power run down into that valley in 40 years. Ethan went back inside because there was nowhere else with walls. The console read 40,951. He sat down in front of it like sitting down was the only decision left available to him, and he made himself look at the number, because looking at it felt like the only way to keep track of how much of whatever this was he still had left. He thought about calling for relief. He thought about the 2-lane road and the dozen lights, and whether driving down through the valley to leave was actually a way out or just a faster way of arriving at 0. He thought about Petra's number, sitting somewhere in that overlapping chorus, folded into a total that had apparently been running since before he was born, patient as geology, waiting on nothing but time and a listener. Don't let it hear you back. Too late for that. He'd already pinged it. He was already in the tally, wasn't he? Already one of the numbers being recited somewhere under all the others, looping forward into whatever came after zero, the way Petra's was, the way 400 people from a town with no name on current maps apparently were. The only question left was whether being counted and being taken were the same event or two separate ones, and how much runway sat between them. 40,940. He grabbed the truck keys off the hook without letting himself think about it, because thinking about it was how people talked themselves into staying in a room with a countdown in it. The ridge road was one lane, chip seal cracked to gravel at the edges, exactly as long as it had always been. 4.2 miles down to the County 2 lane, a number Ethan had memorized without meaning to, the way you memorize the distance to work. He passed the first mile marker at a speed that should have put the second one under his headlights inside 90 seconds. It took longer than that. He decided he'd miscounted the time is all. Glanced at the dash clock instead of arguing with himself and told himself to just drive. Mile marker 2 took longer to reach than mile marker 1 had. He checked the odometer against the truck's own trip counter, a habit from 100 ordinary drives, and the two numbers had stopped agreeing with each other. The trip counter climbing steadily, the odometer's tenths digit, hanging dead on the same number for longer than 4.2 miles, could reasonably allow. The radio, tuned to nothing in particular, filled with static that wasn't quite static. He almost didn't notice the pattern underneath it. 17 milliseconds, then a beat, then 17 again, until he did, and then he couldn't unhear it, laid under every station on the dial, like it had never needed a station at all. He killed the radio. It didn't help. He could still hear the shape of it, faint in the tire noise, in the engine, in the blood moving in his own ears. Ethan did the only thing that still felt like a decision that belonged to him. He turned the truck around at the first wide shoulder he found and pointed it back the way he'd come, telling himself that made this a controlled retreat and not a failure. The drive back took no time at all. That was almost worse than the drive out taking too long. He came up over the last rise and the relay building was simply there, porch light on, door still propped its exact half-inch, like the building had been patiently waiting the entire time for him to give up. He checked the dash clock without wanting to. 40 minutes had passed since he'd grabbed the keys. He would have sworn, standing in the gravel lot, with the engine still ticking as it cooled, that the whole round trip hadn't taken more than 10. Inside, the console hadn't waited for him to catch up. 40,916. The number had kept falling the entire time he was gone, at exactly the rate it should have for 40 real minutes. Proof, if he'd needed any, that wherever those missing 30 minutes had gone, it hadn't been anywhere outside the count. He understood, standing there with his keys still in his hand, that the ridge road had never been a way out. It had only ever been a longer way of staying. He tried, in the hour that followed, everything a rational man tries. He called the district office and got a machine. He called Petra's old backup, a retired tech named Ose, who picked up on the fourth ring, voice thick with sleep, and who went very quiet. Quiet in a specific way, the way of someone recognizing a sound they'd hoped never to hear again, when Ethan described the burst pattern. "Turn off the dish," Ose said. "Physically, breaker, not software." "It won't stop the countdown from playing, will it?" A long pause. "No," Ose said, "it never has." "Then why?" "Because it stops it counting you twice," Ose said, and hung up. Ethan didn't understand that sentence until he was standing at the breaker panel with his hand on the switch, staring at the number, 40,884 now, and understood all at once The way you understand a fall only after your feet have already left the ground. The number wasn't only tracking who had heard it once. It was tracking exposure, continued contact. Every minute the dish stayed live and pointed the same direction. Every minute he sat in this room and let the chorus keep counting in his ears. He wasn't a single tally mark. He was an accumulating one. He threw the breaker. The relay room went dark and silent in the particular total way only a room can that has spent all night humming with electronics. For 11 seconds, Ethan believed it had worked. Then, from the dead console, no power, no backup battery, nothing that should have been capable of producing sound, the countdown kept going, thin and tinny, coming from somewhere behind the black screen instead of through it, like the signal had simply relocated from the speaker to whatever was left listening. 40,801. It was in the room now, not in the equipment. In the room. Ethan stood in the dark with his hand still on the dead breaker and understood the way Petra must have understood it 11 months or 6 years or 40 years ago, that turning off a dish had never been able to do anything about a signal that didn't need the dish anymore. It had needed the dish to find him. It didn't need it to keep him. He ran. Down the ridge road in the dark, no flashlight, no plan beyond putting distance between himself and the relay building. And the countdown came with him. Not through any speaker, just present, layered into the sound of his own breathing and his own footsteps on the gravel, close enough now that he could pick out individual voices inside the chorus for the first time without slowing anything down. A woman's voice, calm, almost bored, reciting 40,790. Petra's voice, two behind her, 40,788, and then folded into the loop like it had always belonged there, waiting for its turn to come back around. His own voice, saying a number he hadn't said yet. He stopped running. Below him, the dozen lights in the valley had become 13. The number he heard himself say, in a voice that hadn't left his throat, was 40,786. Two behind Petra, which meant, if the pattern held the way every pattern in that valley apparently always had, that the gap between hearing your own number recited back to you and becoming a number some other listener eventually finds 40 years from now was not a long one. He didn't run the rest of the way down into the valley. He didn't have to. The 13 lights were closer than the geometry of the road allowed for, and the last thing Ethan Jennings consciously decided, standing very still on the gravel, with the chorus counting calmly around him, in voices he now recognized as neighbors he'd never met, was that he was not afraid of the dark anymore. He was afraid of how known the dark suddenly felt. 6 days later, a relief technician named Iris Calvo drove up the ridge road for a scheduled shift change and found the relay station's front door propped its usual half-inch, the breaker thrown, the equipment dead, and no sign of the man who was supposed to be finishing an overnight rotation. The official incident report would eventually cite equipment failure and an unauthorized shift abandonment. Iris didn't believe it, not really, but she signed what she was told to sign, the way people do. What she didn't report, because there was no box on the form for it, and because saying it out loud felt like it might matter in a way she didn't want to test, was that when she restored power to the dead console, just to log its last readings before shutdown, one file had somehow kept recording the entire time the breaker was off. 40,781. She didn't play the audio. She told herself that was caution, not fear. She filed the number and left, and didn't notice, driving back down the ridge in the grey morning light, that the valley below, empty on every map for 40 years, now had 14 lights instead of 13.